Hey, super awesome listeners. This week it's part 2 of Jenn's interview with Neill. We pick the interview back up with Jenn's picks.
Well, now we're going to transition into some of your music. This week, listeners, I decided to take 2 of Ben's tracks that I fell in love with so that we could dig into those a little bit more. And everyone knows that listens to the show that anytime I get a chance to ask questions of an artist directly, I dig in. As a music fan, it's so fun for me to be able to ask questions about, the inspiration and the meaning and the intention behind a song. So I'm super happy that you allowed me to choose 2 of your tracks to talk about next. And the first song that I picked was a song called Morphic Resonance. And I chose the Spectral mix to put on the playlist. This is from a single that had 2 mixes that you released in March of this year with Dr. Rupurt Sheldrake, who I believe is kind of the originator of this theory of morphic resonance,
Yes.
which I'm going to, I'm jumping into the deep end here and I'm certainly not qualified, but from what I understand, it's sort of, the suggestion that organisms inherit a collective memory that influences their form and behavior. And this sort of like operates across time and space and influences all of us. And so I'm super curious. I loved this song. I liked both mixes, actually. There's the bifurcate mix and the spectral mix. And they're different, but I found myself like I kept going back to the spectral mix for some reason. Maybe it's that minimalist approach that you talked about. I really felt that in the spectral mix of the song, and just kept discovering new things every single time. Whereas I said the Hassle song to me was sort of like soundscape jazz. This song to me was so cinematic. I felt like I could see it, it was like it could be an Interstellar or Ad Astra or something like that. Like it just took me to this place that I felt was so beautiful and almost weightless. I know that sounds strange, but that was sort of where I went every time I listened to this song. And so I was wondering that as I was listening, like, where do you hope your music takes people? Like, do you have that in mind when you're composing, or is it more just, you're trying to get the music out and wherever it takes people, it takes them? Like, how intentional are you about sort of structuring a journey for someone and hoping that that's where it goes versus just putting your music out there and letting the music take people to a certain place?
It's a good question. Thanks for all those kind words. I think, for me, one of the things about working with the kinds of electronic system that I'm working with, which is, has really evolved over the years, is that one of the things that I really enjoy is, and I think I would say it's possibly what is the most delightful aspect of working with my instrument system, in which my acoustic playing is very integrated with the digital, is when I'm able to set something in motion. Again, coming back to the idea of surprise, where I'm able to set something in motion that's not just pure randomness, that is usually based on some kind of a ratio or system of numbers or a chord or something like that, that comes back at me and surprises me. And so in other words, I want the music to take me somewhere.
Okay.
If it's not taking me somewhere, I don't feel like it's ever going to take anybody else anywhere. And I am always thinking about trying to take people on some kind of a journey. I mean, frankly, one of the things, and I do talk about it in the book at some length, that was very much influential on my whole shift from just being a classical trumpet player, conventional trumpet performer, into this kind of creative musical world, was my experience with psychedelic drugs. And so much of the music that I've been attracted to over the years, and a lot of the philosophies, including Rupert Sheldrake, are are connected with the idea of consciousness expansion. And I really think about music as being, in a sense, another form of consciousness expansion. So particularly in a track like the spectral mix that you chose, that's very much where I'm the way that I'm hoping that it functions, that it kind of takes people into some kind of otherworldly experience, because that's what I really enjoy too. And I think you could, if you look at the two songs that I chose, you could also say that about both of them. They're pretty
Yeah.
trippy.
Well, you know what though? I love that because I did like mission accomplished. I did go on a journey every time I listened. And this might be a good point to ask this question too, since you brought up the book and sort of this connection you have to consciousness and expanding it. I'm interested to learn how, it seems that a big theme in the book is how technology is reshaping music and, enabling unprecedented levels of creativity. We talked about that. So, how are you sort of reckoning that, right? This, to me, consciousness requires deep presence. And if you're incorporating technology, how do you bring that in a way that still feels connected to the soul? Do you know what I mean? Like, I think of like AI and I think, oh, that feels so disconnected from the soul of what humans do when they're creating. How do those sort of come together for you in a way that makes sense and doesn't feel like it's sort of betraying the artistic soul or spirit of creating something with your own two hands? And not that you're not, of course, we're not so advanced on AI and other technologies yet that they're doing it entirely on their own, but it does still feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect there. How do you sort of square that circle?
Well, that's really one of the main reasons that I wrote the book, was when I look around and I see all the fear that is out there right now about these AI technologies. And the book has a historical, strong historical element to it, in which what I'm basically trying to say is that this idea of music becoming more and more something that anyone can do, and something that is not necessarily tied to traditional musical ability or talent or something like that, that this is not an aberration. This is not something that is just popping up now. This is an idea that's been percolating and has been spawned and fostered for 100 years. And I worked with a lot of the people that I talk about in the book, like Lamont Young, John Cage, and of course, John Hassel, on and on, punk rock. I mean, there have been all these different ways in which music, different kinds of musicians, and not just music, also visual art. I start with Marcel Duchamp, who
Hmm.
brought the urinal into the art gallery, and he
Yeah.
also wrote music using chance operations. So I feel that technology and music have always been very closely related. One of the quotes in the book is from Jaron Lanier, the inventor of virtual reality, who notes that historically throughout the world, musical instruments and weapons have tended to be the most advanced technologies in any society. So music has always had this very tight relationship with technology, more than the other arts. But at the same time, every time there's a technological innovation introduced, there's tremendous anxiety, whether it was recordings, radio, synthesizers, drum machines, samplers. Over and over again, we see this reaction of, oh my God, we have drum machines. We're not going to have any more drummers. And I think what we've seen is that, what happens is, yeah, okay, there is an initial shock or impact, but what tends to happen is that these technologies just get kind of subsumed into the whole mode of expression. And I think, AI is a little different, because of the fact that it does have the capability of, just generating a whole song from a prompt. I mean, I'm using some AI tools in my current work, particularly around creating beats. There's a particular software that I'm using that does just that improvises. I can give it a pattern and say, okay, now start improvising on that. But that's just, I have tools that I've been using like that for 15 years. It's just like they're better now than they used to be. So I am not one of the naysayers. I'm not one of the people that's saying, there's this article going around right now in the Atlantic that someone wrote saying this is the worst cultural period in history and it's all dehumanizing. And in some ways, for those who are working with AI tools in a studio kind of setting, I mean, not just somebody who's approaching it from a totally non-musician point of view. The nice thing about, for instance, this drum program that I'm talking about is that just like ChatGPT learns who we are, this thing will learn what I like. So when it improvises something that I like, I can say, hey, I like that. And then it's going to remember that and it'll improvise something more like that the next time. And in a sense, excuse me, that becomes almost more personal than what we have now, which is basically oftentimes everybody's working with the same set of loops that come with Logic Pro or Ableton Live or whatever it is. So yeah, I of course I'm not Pollyanna-ish in the book. I don't ignore the fact that there is a lot of feeling of being threatened by these technologies. But my idea is that the artists of the future have to evolve with this and they have to create music in a new way that is for this context of superabundance and a world in which more and more people want to participate in the musical art, not just be passive listeners. So, I mean, Eno said back in the 90s, our grandchildren might look back and say, wow, you mean you used to listen to a recording the same way every time?
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
true. Well, and I think too, time will tell. Like, I love your response, and I love that it's not fear based. And I love that you also came from a time before these tools were accessible and are sort of learning how to, create a marriage between all of it that works. And I think in the end of the day, if something feels false, especially music, it's not going to work anyway, right? Like time will tell. Like that will be the great predictor or the great indicator, I guess, of whether something is, I'm air quoting, good or not. And for me, if it feels false, I'm going to put it aside every single time, no matter what genre it is.
Yeah.
And so I think that's going to be sort of the fine line that artists are going to have to walk. It's like you said, incorporating these tools in a way that feels authentic and genuine and true to their vision, rather than just like, oh, I'm going to hit the easy button. I think if we feel like an artist is phoning it in, that art's perhaps not going to resonate in the way that the artist or the listener would want it to either, right?
Yeah, and one of the things, sort of in particularly in the last chapters of the book that I talk about is I do feel the artists of the future will be engaged not only in just trying to make their own musical masterpiece that people are going to listen to, but in creating ways that will shape the creativity of others. As more and more people want to get involved in music making, and there are several examples that I talk about, and I'm actually doing my own podcast now where I'm featuring interviews with people that are creating these tools. Most of them are musicians themselves. They're all musicians themselves, but they're also creating, whether it's software or hardware or something like what Holly Herndon and Grimes have done, where they allow people to implement their own musical melodies using their voices. So ways that the artist can be a kind of shaper
Yeah.
of the creativity of others. I think that whole kind of thing is really going to be very much more important as we go forward.
So interesting. It really is an interesting time. And I'm excited to be a part of it. I'm excited to talk about it. I'm excited to learn more about it. So I value this conversation so much. And I feel like this is a great segue into our final track of this episode. And I have to say, before I even introduce it, this was my favorite song on this week's playlist, hands down. I love this track. And it is by you, Ben. It's a song called Shiny Nickel from your Automotive album from 2002. Again, listen to this album beginning to end. There are so many great tracks on it. It was hard for me to narrow down. I love Iceman. I love Turbo Electric. I thought there were so many great tracks here, but Shiny Nickel was where I kept coming back and kept coming back. And so I'm like, you know what? That's got to be the one for this week. And I think just again, because this song was such a favorite of mine, now might be a great time for you to talk a little bit more about Mutant Trumpet and sort of how that came to you. I mean, we've talked a little bit about, the Hassel and Eno influence, but what made you think, like, you know what? I like playing the trumpet, but what if? I mean, that
Yeah.
feels like a bold move.
Yeah. Well, I had a trumpet that I was able to had a removable bell, and that was just it's a design that came along that was supposed to make the trumpet play a little better. But what I started fooling around with, taking the bell off and sticking it onto another trumpet. The normal trumpet has the 3 valves, right? And so each of those valves has a slide that you could attach something to. So I would just take this extra bell and stick it onto the first valve slide. And of course, it meant that you couldn't really play the trumpet in a normal way because the first valve didn't work normally anymore.
Right.
It just became this thing that would switch. But what I was interested in was when I would put a mute in one bell or two and have one open or 2 different mutes, and then I would slowly switch from one sound to the other, it would create this kind of quasi electronic sound of like a filter sweeping,
Yep.
like that kind of thing. And I had been playing a lot of, I was I don't know, in my early 20s, and I'd been playing a lot of contemporary music. I was interested in, experimental music, John Cage and Stockhausen and all that stuff, and also listening to a lot of Miles Davis's work from around that time in the 70s. So when he went electric, and of course he was also a huge influence on John Hassel too, no doubt. But then and then I started playing around with synthesizers. I got a little Korg MS-10 synthesizer around that same time that I could actually plug in a microphone into the filter and just fooling around with that. And I happened to be in a brass group with a guy who had worked at the King Instrument Factory. And we started talking. We got this idea, hey, let's make one with the bell attached, but with an extra set of valves so that I would be able to have an extra set of valves to switch around. And shortly after that, we did that. We just did it with like a couple of old beat up student trumpets, and I didn't have a case for it. I used to carry it around in a laundry bag. This is kind of like when I was touring around the Midwest in a van, and I heard a certain ratio and all that. But then I wanted to go farther with integrating electronics, and I happened to see an ad in the back of Keyboard magazine where Robert Moog was looking for independent projects because he had sold his interest in the Moog company at that time. And I approached him, and he became another mentor to me. He was very interested in what I was doing. Again, it was such a fledgling thing. I thought people might just look at it and think it was a joke or something. But he was really into it, and he invited me up to his home. He was first he was living in Asheville, North Carolina, and then he moved up to Boston. He was working with Ray Kurzweil, designing the first touch-sensitive keyboards in the early days of MIDI. So he put together my first analog processing system, which is sitting right here behind me. It still works. I don't really use it that much anymore. Everything's digital, but And then from that point on, when I moved to New York, I started becoming more and more serious about it. And gradually, it just really became the focus of what I do. And with the whole notion of it always being to create this very kind of multi-layered synergy between the acoustic trumpet that is still played as an acoustic trumpet. It's not purely electronic. It makes acoustic sound, but merging that with technology in a different way. And then the other aspect that was really crucial was in the early 90s, I was invited to the STIM musical instrument research facility in Amsterdam, where I was an artist in residence on a regular basis until the institution closed in 2019, I think it was.
Hmm.
And that was where I really got the They really helped me in terms of building the trumpet into a full-fledged MIDI controller, a digital interface instrument, which now has 28 different controllers on it, and distance sensors, joysticks, buttons, and knobs, and the software that I'm using. Just if you and like with the Morphic resonance track that you chose,
Yes.
all of the and this is something that took me a long time to achieve. But in that song, with the exception of some of the samples of Sheldrake's voice, which are in there,
Yeah.
every sound in that tune is created through a live performance on the mutant trumpet. There are no synthesizers. There are no external sounds. It's only my acoustic sounds that are being live sampled and played back and modulated and manipulated in real time. And so pretty much everything I'm doing now is using that. And in a way, that was my original goal, was to make an instrument that would enable me to have a fully musical, to fully express myself musically just with the instrument. It took me about 40 years
Wow.
to get there.
It
But
co-
as Don Cherry said, a lifetime isn't enough to learn music. So.
Right. Well, and I love too. I think that was the other thing I loved about these two tracks is that, one was from the early 2000s, Shiny Nickel, the fourth track that appears on our playlist. And I loved it. And then I also loved being able to come into, a track that you literally released 2 months ago with Morphic Resonance, and sort of hear the difference and the evolution and what I liked and what changed and what stayed the same. And so I didn't intentionally do it, but when I was going through and listening to the playlist in preparation for the show, I was really pleased that that we did have sort of two ends of your journey.
I think they're very complimentary. Well, I mean, and the automotive album, I mean, that's a whole other story. All of the music on that album. One of the things, when I did 2 albums with Verve in the end of the 90s, and I also did an album with Astralworks. So those were the albums that I did on the labels that were, like the biggest labels. And I was touring a lot, and long before I started teaching. And I got a letter one day from this guy who said, "Hey, would you ever want to do some music for a Volkswagen commercial?" And I said, "Oh, wow, that's an interesting idea." I mean, I had never thought about doing music for a commercial. I mean, back then, we're talking like 98. It was still not really cool to do music for commercials.
It was before Zeppelin sold out for Cadillac.
Right. If people did music for commercials, they wouldn't talk about it.
Right.
I mean, it was kind of taboo, But this guy, Lance Jensen, he created the Drivers Wanted campaign. And he was really one of the people who first started bringing in more cool music into commercials with the Nick Drake song, the Nick Drake Pink Moon Spot, which is, well, I ended up getting into this very interesting relationship with Volkswagen, where I basically did all of the music for their commercials and websites for several years. And it was pretty all-consuming. It kept me really busy. It was also very lucrative. I mean, I was making as much money to do a 30-second ad as I had been getting to do a whole album, even with Verve. Well, after doing about a dozen of these ads and promotional events for them and everything, I kind of looked at it and I was like, this, because the cool thing was they weren't really telling me what to do. Usually when you're doing music for ads, they want you to jump through hoops and do
Right.
like a steel guitar and a piccolo and a tuba, or something. You never know what they're going to say. But it was really a very easy relationship where they seemed to be pretty happy with all the things I was making. And so I got to a point and I said, well, look, I've got all these songs. I could make an album out of these. And my manager at the time had negotiated a deal where I was able to hold on to the underlying copyrights of the music. And so we made this kind of three-way partnership between Volkswagen, the ad agency, and then I got 6 Degrees Records out of San Francisco involved, and they were interested in putting it out. So, and that's, the title Automotive, it
Yeah.
refers to the fact that all of that music was created for TV commercials. And the Shiny Nickel song, it also has a kind of brooding, lonely sort of sound for it. And if I don't know if you recall or if people recall, but after 9/11, they stopped running commercials. There were no commercials for a while because commercials just seemed out of place. And it was one of the first commercials that started running after 9/11. And what's in the commercial is the guy is walking down the street, and a lonely street. They said they were interested in creating an atmosphere like Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, the famous
Huh.
painting, where it's
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
lonely, forlorn kind of, mournful sort of sound. And the guy's walking down the street and he sees the car in the showroom window, and then he looks down and sees a nickel, and he picks it up, and then when he looks back, the car's gone. So it was
Ah.
a kind of, I thought it was actually, and people may think I'm crazy to say that a commercial could be poetic, but we all were experiencing that. I was living
Yeah.
in Lower Manhattan during 9/11, and still to this day, when I go down there and I look, I can't believe that those buildings aren't still there, right?
Yeah.
So that was the inspiration for that song and that album, which was a very different kind of thing than what I'm doing now.
Yeah, I dug it though, I have to say, like, I really like that whole album, I really enjoyed, so, I'm glad that it happened that way and that Volkswagen allowed so much material that I got to enjoy that entire
Yeah,
automotive album. It was great.
yeah. No, it was a great creative collaboration for me. And again, like going back to where we sort of what we first started with, I was always thrilled. Excuse me, I was thrilled that to turn on the TV and have my music on there. And
Yeah.
I did a run of ads for Cadillac a few years later too. So yeah.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for sharing what you're listening to this week. This was so amazing. And listeners, I think you're going to really be blown away by this 4-track playlist. It's just different than a lot of the playlists we put out on the show. And I think that it's so accessible, yet so interesting and different, not heavily lyrics based, not really lyrics based at all, and still able to communicate so many different feelings and emotions. I really am so grateful that you joined me, and I appreciate you taking the time to do the show.
Oh, thank you so much. And I really appreciate you delving into the material so deeply, and your questions and the whole concept of the show. It's just very provocative and sort of got me thinking about some things in a different way, which is always great. Always love
Good.
that surprise, right?
Right? We always do. Well, and it's always like mutual inspiration is the goal, right? So I'm always happy about that.
Great. All right.
Um,
Thanks so much, Jen.
Yeah, you're welcome. And listeners, if you'd like to learn more about Ben's music, you can find him on Spotify under Ben Neill with 2 L's. And also, please check out his book. You can learn more about that. The book is called Diffusing Music. If you go to bloomsbury.com, that's BLOOMSBURY.com, and search for Diffusing Music, you'll find it there. Just based on what you've shared today, tons of interesting concepts and stories in there. So be sure to check that out.
It's on Amazon too, by the way. So,
on Amazon
yeah,
too.
yeah,
There
yeah.
you go. And as always, please be sure to follow, download, and share this show. And if you love listening, drop a review on Apple or Spotify for us. Last but not least, to stay informed on all things Super Awesome Mix and what are you listening to, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Super Awesome Mix. Thanks for listening, and please join me again next week to find your new favorite song.